41 African countries are set for stronger growth in 2024. This according to the African Development Bank's economic outlook. The growth projections are set to keep the continent as the second fastest growing region in the world. The report also proposes bold reforms of the global financial architecture and how to strengthen the African voice in multilateral development banks. Joining us to unpack the AfDB's Africa Economic Outlook report is Ridle Markus, Sub-Saharan Africa and a macroeconomist at Absa CIB. Ridle, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, good afternoon. Always great to catch up with you guys.
Wonderful. According to the AfDB, the rebound in Africa's average growth includes a rise to 3.74% in 2024 and 4.3% in 2025. That's quite optimistic, right? And let's talk about that optimism.
Yeah, look, I don't think it's necessarily anything surprising. I do think that yes, number one is that the growth rate for the continent has actually slowed down from over 4% to 3.1% in 2023. And now they've lifted the growth for countries such as, say, Ghana, Nigeria, etc., Ivory Coast, Senegal, and a few others. And they believe, of course, that East African markets are going to be the fastest growing markets. That again, no surprise to us. We ourselves put out a report just a couple of days ago saying that East African markets are very well positioned to continue to grow, probably at 5% plus. So, you know, with the more resilient global economy, and I think that's a theme that also stood out in this report from the African Development Bank, is that they continued with the theme of global resilience into the in the African space. And as a result, they think that global demand will improve. The transformation that is happening in Africa at this point will also continue to support growth. Lower policy rates, for example, we've seen very high policy or much tighter monetary policy in 2022 and 23, but that is coming, probably not coming to an end now, but we expect many more central banks to start cutting the policy rate. So there's quite a few drivers here that could potentially get you to these kind of growth levels. On average, of course, that's 3.7%. Just one final thought on that issue. Keep in mind that they also mentioned that I think around 15 or 17 economies are going to grow at 5% plus. Again, you know, that's something to take note of. And West African markets, maybe one or two, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and then many of the East African markets are going to grow by those growth rates.
I want to speak also about the interesting thing of these growth projections here, Ridle, and how few of them actually, if any, rest on resources, which is a new thing for African countries here, that growth would not be, underpinned by some form of mining.
Yeah, I missed some part of that question there, but look, several of the economies have actually been doing fairly well, non-mining related economies, etc. Of course, I think the relevant issues here are probably to focus a little bit on some of the growth risks that we have at this point in time. Extreme weather events, and that is a theme, or climate change, that's a theme that came out in this report. And some of our markets are being, hampered by that. So, for example, look at Zambia. It's a mining economy, largely. Agriculture has always been a strong sector in Zambia, but it's been hammered now by the extreme weather conditions or the drought there. Many of the Southern African economies too. So yes, there's probably a if you can call it, a bit of a growth rotation taking place for some of the non-mining economies doing fairly well, some of the mining economies having sort of very idiosyncratic issues, keeping their growth in check. And that, of course, is a concern, particularly for your larger markets. If you take into account that South Africa's growth is probably going to linger around to 1% or just over 1%, Angola probably short of 3%, well short of 3%, we think 1.7%, and Nigeria just over 3%. Those are some of the largest economies in Sub-Sahara alone. Egypt in North Africa, having got their issues. So you'll see that North African growth has actually also been downgraded. So a couple of the key economies around the region, mining or non-mining, are actually having some serious challenges at this point in time. So that growth rate that you mentioned earlier that seemed a little bit optimistic could actually have been somewhat better if these key countries actually perform to their full potential.
Let's also then speak about East Africa, because of course that's where we're seeing a lot of the growth here. And I'm wondering if that's really that regional integration that we see in that part of the continent could also be assisting to boost the region here. And also, Ridle, where the green shoots are for East Africa.
So I think East Africa is very much driven by a lot of infrastructure projects. Look, agriculture is strong. Yes, weather conditions have not been favorable given the devastating floods that we've seen, but there's a lot of activity happening in those economies. Notably, of course, Kenya, Uganda is getting ready to pump oil from 2025, perhaps in 2026. East African pipeline is being constructed, railways are being constructed. So there's a lot of activity in that area. Tanzania, the same. They're working towards LNG production, but at the same time, there's a lot of infrastructure projects around the oil and gas sector, but also road network, rail network, etc., being developed. So those kind of countries, or those countries, are really doing well, and they have done well even before COVID. Also driven by infrastructure, also driven by the strong agriculture sector. And I think that's also a point that the AfDB highlights, is that the agriculture sector is going to continue to play a strong role in those economies, despite the weather conditions.
And then before we depart here, one thing I'm also keen to speak about as we see these growth prospects for the African continent, a big important one is, first of all, the ability for people to be employed, and then just for upward mobility for ordinary citizens. Ridle, might it be possible that we might see this growth spurt for the African continent and it not relate to just better lives for ordinary people?
Yeah, I think... talking about better lives, one or two themes that came out from this Africa Development Report is that the average real GDP per capita remains probably the lowest in the world. So that is something that needs to get attention, despite the fact that Africa has grown by close to 4% on average prior to COVID. We still have had a very high population growth rate. So the real GDP per capita actually did not increase as we would have hoped to. Also then, of course, the living cost crisis that we saw since 2022-23 with the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war, higher fuel, commodity prices and food prices, food insecurity starting to come through. So living conditions have really been tough for many of the continent's nations, with food security a particular concern. And I think that is something that the AfDB is asking, we need to continue with the transformation of these economies. We obviously need to address, the high inflation rates, etc. We need to, move from a mining economy or mining-driven sort of continent, industrialize a bit more. So we probably failed to industrialize enough. So there's a whole lot of areas that need attention for this continent to actually uplift the people and also reach its full potential in terms of growth.
Well, Ridle, always a pleasure catching up with you. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That was Ridle Markus, Sub-Saharan African macroeconomist at Absa CIB.